a Thursday was a really torrid day for us in the Senate. Things were reasonably peaceful up until about 11:45, when the government's relatively uncontroversial, almost innocuous bill, tidying up a few things on immigration, suddenly became a major piece of legislation, because some amendments had been moved to it, led by Tim Storer, who's basically a Green in disguise, supported by the Greens, supported by Labor, which were intended to remove from the Minister for Immigration the discretion to transfer people from offshore detention, Nauru and Manus Island, to Australia. Their argument was that that was a medical decision and the minister should be excluded. The government saw that as a threat to their immigration policy. They argued that if this occurred, that would give encouragement to people smugglers and that the boats would start again. Who knows? Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. I guess it's pretty unfair, though, to criticise the government, this coalition government, over the people who are still, over the fact that there are people still on Manus Island and Nauru. When they came into power in 2013, there were detention camps established by the Gillard Rudd government. There were thousands of people in them, including many, many children, as a result of Labor's policy of offshore detention. And stopping the boats, of course, was Tony Abbott's biggest election claim. And well, they stopped the boats, the people stopped coming, the boats that were being sunk at sea and people were drowning, that all stopped. But there were still a lot of people in offshore detention. The coalition government has closed those detention camps. There's nobody on Manus Island or in Nauru who is in a detention camp. They're all out in the community, and in fact there's very few people there on either place really. It's down to a few hundred. The government arranged the transfer of people to the United States with Donald Trump, and actually they're now down to 10 children on Nauru. They're living in the community. More than half of them don't even want to come to Australia. So this issue is really about nothing, and it comes down to virtue signalling. You know, I'm more compassionate than you, type stuff by Labor and the Greens and the likes of Tim Storer and Darren Hinch and the Centre Alliance people also were in on this nonsense. It's a manufactured issue. Really, it doesn't deserve the attention it's been given. But the opposition attempt to basically take away from the Immigration Minister the ability to deny transfer to Australia of illegal immigrants became a big issue to the government. So they fought very hard. So this bill that was commenced at 11:45 yesterday suddenly had a huge number of speakers on the speakers list, and the government just filibustered and filibustered, with some help from Cory Bernardi, it must be said, and a little bit from Pauline Hanson as well, just to delay it. And they delayed it all the way through until 4:30. There were divisions on everything, division after division after division. There was attempts to suspend standing orders. There were votes on that the motion be put, just division after division after division. And the government was determined to ensure that the bill, which was going to pass, they knew they didn't have the numbers, wouldn't be able to go back to the House of Representatives, where it would probably pass too, with the support of the crossbenchers in the House, and become law. So the government fought and fought until 4:30. It was all a bit crazy. And then I voted against, ultimately I voted against the bill. I voted largely with the government, although some of the amendments that the government wanted to bring in of its own. It moved lots and lots of amendments, weren't all that flash, so one or two of them I didn't support. But I didn't see it as a particularly big issue from a libertarian perspective anyway. Then we got to 4:30 and the government was getting anxious about considering its access and assistance bill, the Encryption bill. And they wanted it dealt with. Everybody wanted to go home. It was the last day of sitting for the week. It was the last day before the long break. They knew that without Labor's support they'd never get a motion through to extend hours. None of us are very keen on that idea. It's been misused so much in the past. So there'd been negotiations all day on that encryption bill. I'd had a meeting with the Shadow Attorney General in the morning, Mark Dreyfus, who had come to me and explained that the Parliamentary Committee, a joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, had been considering the draft bill for quite some time. Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, had told the committee that he wanted the deliberations to finish so the bill could be passed by Christmas time. That committee was very unhappy about that because they had quite a lot of work to do still, quite a lot of aspects of the bill to consider. But nonetheless, the government members of the committee pressed on, and after quite late hours and a lot of work, they came to an agreement on Wednesday night. The amendments consistent with what they had agreed on were then drafted overnight. And what Mark Dreyfus told me was that at 6:30 a.m. on Thursday, yesterday, he had received those amendments, but they were not consistent with what the committee had agreed. So he was very unhappy, and he told me Labor was going to move its own amendments, which did reflect what the committee had agreed, and he was seeking my support. Well, it's very complex legislation. It's got quite sinister implications. I intended to vote against the bill at the second and third reading anyway. So I said, yes, all right, well, I will support your amendments as well. So that was fine. I spoke then to Corey Bernardi. He took much the same view. He said he was opposed to the bill, but he would support Labor's amendments. Brian Burston was in the same boat. And then I found out Centre Alliance was pretty much on board. I assumed that Storer and Hinch, who always vote with the Greens, were on board, and of course I knew the Greens were in that situation too. So it was clear that Labor had the numbers to get its amendments up. The government was obviously determined not for that not to occur. But in order to prevent the House of Representatives from considering the amended immigration bill, Christopher Pyne, who's the leader of the government in the House, had moved that the House adjourn at 4:30, which is its normal time on a Thursday afternoon. They go into adjournment at 4:30 and then they rise at 5 o'clock. So by 4:30 there was no chance of the immigration bill going back to the House, but also there was no chance of the encryption bill going back to the House. So there we were, all set to vote up the Labor's amendments, and then I was going to vote against the bill even if it was amended at the second and third or the third reading. And Labor folded. Labor collapsed their tent and said, no, we're not going to proceed with our amendments. They withdrew them. I was sitting in the chamber at that time. And it was quite a shock. They didn't tell me. I only found out about it indirectly. So I was pretty pissed off about it. They're very weak. In fact, I told someone this morning they've got the backbone of a jellyfish. So I voted against the bill when it came up, but it was pretty immaterial because Labor and the government were voting together. There was only about 15 of us, I think, on the no side, the Greens and some of the crossbench, Brian Burston and me. I'm not sure whether even Hinch and Storer were over there. So it's been voted up. Now this ridiculous thing about it, of course, is that the bill gives the agencies the opportunity to go to court and get a warrant to basically spy on your smartphone and crack your encryption if they can. The idea that the bill is going to be in place and able to be used to prevent a terrorist attack at Christmas time is farcical. I mean, what are we, 3 weeks away from Christmas, less than that. The bill will lucky to be gazetted by Christmas time, and certainly there will be absolutely no chance that they could go to a court and say we need a warrant in order to spy on somebody's encrypted smartphone. It's ridiculous. In fact, it's a blatant lie, and Labor, of course, were too stupid to realise that, and they fell for it. So that occupied a lot of time yesterday and the build up to it during the week as well. During the week I introduced my final bill before the election, which is the bill to implement the Liberal Democrats' tax policy. The bill has taken quite a long time to get organised. We had to get costings from the Parliamentary Budget Office. We had to ensure that what we were talking about wasn't just pie in the sky stuff. In short, the tax policy is for personal tax, $40,000 tax-free threshold, 20% flat tax above that, company tax 20%, abolishing tax on tobacco, alcohol and petrol, plus luxury car tax, tariffs, excises, things like that. It would mean everybody kept more of their own money, had more money in their pocket. You know, it would certainly be the equivalent of a wage rise for everybody else. Now, the obvious point is, of course, that the government would have a lot less money. Taxes would be about halved, and so the government would have to cut spending. Now, people say, oh, but what about, where's the money going to be cut from? And of course, that's the issue. If you've got more money in your pocket, you don't need the government paying for so many things. And there's lots and lots and lots of areas where government expenditure is unnecessary. The government should stick to things that only governments can do. And when you think about it, there's not many things that only governments can do. The private sector, business, charities, benevolent organisations, they can do many things that governments do, usually better, because you haven't got bureaucrats all over the place working short hours and having long lunches. So really there's lots and lots of ways in which spending can be cut, and nobody will be hurt. Doesn't mean pensioners will be starving in the streets and children will be going homeless and shoeless. It doesn't mean anything like that at all. What it does mean is that, for example, the government wouldn't be necessarily spending lots and lots of money on middle-class welfare, which is giving money to people who are not poor. Welfare should be for poor people. That's just one area. So our tax bill is part of a very coherent policy to shrink the size of the government, bring it down to the size that we think it ought to be, which is about half its current size. Used to be at that level. In fact, if you go back to the days of the Labor government in the Whitlam era, that's about the size that it was. So it's not radical in historical terms, it's just radical in terms of the last couple of decades. And we have identified where spending can occur. Of course, it wasn't in the bill, but if you look at my alternative budget that I publish each year in the Financial Review, you get a very good idea where the spending cuts would occur, and they are on the Liberal Democrats' website, as well as my personal website. Also this week, I tabled the final report of the Red Tape Committee. This has been a select committee of the Senate, which I chaired. I established it back in late 2016, so it's been running now 2 years. We've done interim reports on 9 topics, I think it is, and so when a Senate committee makes a report, it goes off to the government has to respond. And we've had responses to about 3 or 4 of the topics, but the others are still waiting. The report sits there as a sort of source of information for the government when they're developing policy on those areas. In each case, the recommendations to reduce red tape have been practical, certainly not pie in the sky. It wasn't possible for me to just be purist libertarian on those sorts of things. It's a committee report. Some of them, the Labor Party dissented, the Greens didn't participate. Some of them the Liberals supported. I had some pretty good Liberals on my side on the committee. It's been an awful lot of work, and it's given hope to a lot of people in industries where red tape is a big problem that someone's batting on their side. If you're interested, the Red Tape Committee reports, all of them are on the Australian Parliament House website, and they can be downloaded, and I recommend that you do that if you're interested in that topic. We had the government's bill to make GST distribution fair, supposedly. They really didn't make it fair at all. What they did was take billions of dollars out of consolidated revenue and throw it into this pot of money, which they called GST revenue, and bulk it up and then give more to Western Australia. That's pretty much how it worked out. Each of the states gets a little bit more, but Western Australia gets most of it. They did nothing about the fact that South Australia and Tasmania are basically lazy bludgers at the government level anyway, and they don't run their state economy particularly well. As a result, they don't generate very much in the way of, or enough in the way of GST revenue, and they have to be bailed out by the other states. There's no incentive to run their state governments better, to boost the economy better under the current system. And all they're doing really, to coin a phrase, is putting a band-aid on cancer. Anyway, the Western Australians are happy. They've got more money coming their way, and that was what it was mainly about. The government was in danger of losing some seats in Western Australia. They're very marginal, and they had to throw some money at it to save the seats. Earlier in the week, we had, in fact pretty much all week, we had this argument about implementing what Scott Morrison had said he would do during the Wentworth by-election, which is remove the right of religious schools to discriminate against gay students. I don't know why he did it. I don't know why he said it, because no school's actually done that. They certainly haven't expelled anybody. It is not an issue. It's a theoretical issue. I gave a speech on it, or an interview on it, in which I said that discrimination by the private sector is really not the government's business. It may be abhorrent if a school was to discriminate against gay kids, but parents always had an opportunity to take their kids elsewhere. The only discrimination that I am firmly against and should be prohibited is discrimination by the government, and of course that includes government schools. So there was this big debate about whether the bill would get up. It was fairly clear that the government was close to not having the numbers, and Labor's bill is what kicked it all off, and then the government started to try to amend it. It got quite complex. There are lots of amendments. Even with the amendments, there were claims that it was far from perfect, and there was unhappiness with it, certainly from the coalition side. Even some Labor senators were unhappy with it. There are a few Conservatives on the Labor side as well. So eventually, after much fighting, it got referred to a committee, and that committee will now report back in February, I think it is, and perhaps out of that will come some common sense, and the amendments will be converted into something that everybody can live with to deal with a problem which really doesn't exist anyway. Wasted a lot of time. It's mostly virtue signalling, of course. Mostly people saying, I'm better than you are. My hands are cleaner, and I'm a nicer person. In an attempt to influence voters. I think the only people who will be influenced by it, quite frankly, are those people who are primarily Christian, or perhaps other religions as well, who live a faith-based life. They are very determined to protect their ability to send their kids to faith-based schools and not be interfered with by the government. I sympathise with them entirely. That is a very libertarian position, to be left alone. As long as they're not advocating violence, harm to others, essentially what they want to do is be left alone to practice their faith. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Last week also there was a bill went through to amend the way in which political parties are funded. Now, the Liberal Democrats don't support political funding, government funding. We think it should all be reliant on donations, and the government should basically keep its nose out of those donations and not restrict them. This argument that donations by a political party or a politician, I don't see signs of that. They certainly don't buy the Liberal Democrats. We're a party of principle. I suppose some of the other parties aren't that principled. Perhaps they might be bought, but most of the talk you hear about it is just assertion. There's no serious evidence for any of it at all. And I've sat through inquiry after inquiry after inquiry, waiting to hear somebody give some specific examples, and they can't. The Greens just go on and on and on about the mining companies donating money to the Liberals and Nationals, as if the implication being, if they didn't do that, the Liberals and the Nationals would agree with the Greens that mining's a bad thing. It's fanciful crap. It's just garbage. So anyway, the law now has been changed so that political parties will have to spend the money and then claim reimbursement of it if they get over 4%. Now that's a problem, because you're only going to get back the money you spent. Now, we in the Liberal Democrats, we run in lots of by-elections and elections. Sometimes we get money, sometimes we don't. The ones where we do get money, it's nearly always more than we spent. And of course we use that money on other campaigns, and quite often we don't get any money back on those campaigns. So we use the ones where we're ahead to fund other ones. And it will cramp our style quite severely if we're only able to claim reimbursement. The bigger picture, of course, is that minor parties, even though they are enjoying increasing support from the public, they're never going to be able to break through into mainstream politics and get people elected unless they're very well funded. And basically it's giving a free kick to the likes of Clive Palmer. That's all it's doing. Somebody like Clive Palmer can afford to throw money into a campaign, and irrespective of whether he gets it back or not, he's got the money to do that. There are no other political parties that I know of where they have a rich individual behind them prepared to throw money into it. It's locking out minor parties. A very undemocratic thing to do, given the fact that minor parties are quite popular because the major parties are so hopeless. One of the things that occurred last week was that the New Zealand government confirmed that they were going to allow the sale of e-cigarettes, vaping, as a way for smokers to get off the cigarettes. It led me to ask a question in the Senate: when was Australia going to do something about that? And instead of asking the Health Minister, I asked the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, because Indigenous rates of smoking amongst Indigenous Australians is much, much higher, 4 or 5 times higher than it is amongst everybody else. And if it was going to help anyone, if vaping was going to help anyone, it would help Indigenous people. Well, the senator responsible for Indigenous Affairs, Senator Scullion, he's actually pretty sympathetic to vaping, and the National Party's in favour of it. So he gave an answer which suggested that he was a little bit equivocal about it, and he also announced that the ANU was doing a study into vaping. So we followed up, and then he said, well, we'll certainly consult you on that study, the ANU study. Well, apparently that really seriously annoyed the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt. But nonetheless, we had a visit this week from the ANU people and someone from Mr. Hunt's office to discuss that ANU study. And guess what? It's just a review of what other people have written, and it's going to take 2 years. It'll change nothing. So really, at the end of the day, the health department and the minister are standing by their no vaping policy. There's no intention of changing, and people who could get off cigarettes and save their own lives will continue to die or become sick because they're smoking tobacco. They wouldn't die and they wouldn't get sick if they were able to get off tobacco and onto vaping. But no, our health department knows what's best for them. So it's a pretty shameful approach. New Zealand, of course, as it so often is far more sensible than Australia. The final item that I thought I would bring to your attention is last week the passage of the Modern Slavery Bill. Now, this has got to be the biggest virtue signalling exercise I've ever heard of. I mean, who favours slavery? You know, it's such a motherhood thing. So passing a law to say, no, slavery is not allowed, or you will do what you can to avoid slavery, well, it all sounds so wonderful. But of course, slavery is thoroughly illegal in Australia. Even the redefined version of slavery, which is sort of indentured workers and things like that, that's illegal too. Trafficking in people, sex workers and so forth, that's illegal. So we're not talking about something in Australia that's illegal and doesn't need any new laws. The Modern Slavery Bill compels companies over a certain size to ask their suppliers, are you engaged in modern slavery? And then they have to certify that they've asked and basically just fill out a form and say, yep, we've found nothing. Now, you can imagine that an Australian company says to their suppliers, are you involved in modern slavery? Are you doing anything of these things? Is the supplier going to come back to this Australian company and say, yep, that's what we're doing? It's just fanciful. It's completely ridiculous. But the cost to the Australian companies of going through this exercise and asking these questions is in the tens of millions of dollars. It's going to cost each company tens of thousands of dollars. And there's several thousand Australian companies that it will affect. It is a ridiculous bureaucratic exercise. Now, at the moment, it's not obligatory. They're talking about naming and shaming companies that don't do it, but at the moment, that's as far as the consequences go. But it will only be a matter of time before they're talking about fining companies for not doing it. If Labor and the Greens have their way, they'll be talking about sending directors to jail for not doing it. To achieve what exactly? Absolutely nothing. It all sounds good, and it's wonderful to be on the side of anti-slavery, but this is not it. So that's just a quick summary. It's been a busy 2 weeks. There's obviously a lot more that happened. Stay on my Facebook page, go to Medium, where all my speeches and interviews are located. Follow me on Twitter, and you'll stay up to date with everything else that's occurred, including things I haven't mentioned.